I wanted to do a quick recording for the Chapter 3 test. It is in 2 parts. I want you to take part 1 the next time you're in class on Thursday, Friday. And I need to look at part 2 before anybody takes that. So focus primarily on part 1. Now you will have to write a class file for this. It'll ask you to write a general class file. It'll tell you what you should use for instance variables and some methods that it wants you to write and a constructor and so on. And that will take you some time. So make sure when you write the class file that you do your private instance variables as it directs you to name them and so on. You're going to want to do at least one constructor based on what the write-up tells you. You may need to do more, but I think it's just one. And then you're going to need to do your accessor and mutator methods at the direction of the write-up. It's going to tell you what to name them and what it wants them to return, if anything, and so on. So remember, try not to forget the constructor. Of course, if it's appropriate, you can always leverage off of the default constructor that I've mentioned in other recordings. That's always available to you, whether it's coded or not, but it doesn't do anything but set default values. It sets numerics to 0 and so on. Alright, so that brings me to a couple other topics. I want to make sure you understand what we call scope or visibility, and that is always either going to be public or private. Those are the two options for scope or visibility. And that specifies where a variable or a method can be seen or where it can be used. Okay? So if we're in a class file, so take for example employee, we have public methods generally, that's generally what we do, and all of our constructors will be public. But we have the option to make other methods in the class, little helper methods, private, and sometimes we do that. If a method is private, it can only be used within the class file. So here's an example. I have my constructor, which is public. Constructors are useless if they're not public, so they are always public. That means I can use it in main. I can say employee 1 equals new employee paren Jane Doe 50,000. If I were to make this private, I couldn't use it in main, so I could never create an object with it. So it would be pointless to have a private constructor. So, and I've got my typical get name, which is an accessor, that's public. Now in this one I've split out first name and last name into 2 different instance variables. And maybe when I print it out I want to return first name space last name. So what I can do is I can create a little helper method and make it private where I do combine the first and last names, and then I invoke or call or execute that method in another method in this class file, and then I can leverage off of that full name with my accessor. Okay, so what I want to show you is I cannot do one.name combo in main. I cannot do this because that method is private. Main can't see it. When main will tell you it doesn't exist, or accessor scope out of range or something like that, telling you that you can't see or use or invoke or call that method in main, and the first thing you need to do is go back and look and say, oh yes, it's private. But notice get name is public, so that's absolutely fine for me to do one.getName. So any public method I can use in main. Any private method can only be used within the class. And hence, I hope it makes sense to you that constructors have to be public. Because if that constructor is private, I can't do this line right here. I have no way to create an employee object. I cannot create one within the class file. I have to use main to call the constructor in the class file to create the object. If the constructor is private, it can never be called or invoked. The objects can never be created. The instance variables can never be created in memory or set up. So constructors are always public. Other methods are generally public. But we have these little helper methods sometimes that we make private and we only use within the class file. Notice that private is also used for the instance variables. We do not make our instance variables public. We always make them private to protect the data. And also want to point out, when you declare a variable within a method, that is by default private to that method. It's a local variable. It is a temporary variable. It can only be referenced inside this method, so it has a limited scope. So in effect, it's private to the method. So I can use des, short for decimal, anywhere in set salary, but I cannot come up to any other method and try to reference des, okay? I cannot do that. I will get an error. Des only exists, is only usable in the method it's declared in because it is a local variable. Whereas these are instance variables. They can be used anywhere in any method in the class file. Here's another example of a local, temporary, private variable, full name, that can only be referenced in the getName method. I cannot use that anywhere else. And here I forgot to fix my constructor to pass in the salary. All right, so cannot reference private methods in main. Public methods are fine. Also, because these instance variables are private, I can never directly manipulate them in main. I'm going to get the same type of error that they don't exist or they're private specifier. I can't remember. But I cannot do one.name first equals and set the name. That will not work. What I can do is call the setter or mutator method, which is public, set first. Oh, I did that wrong. And I can pass it the value Jamie, and then it will come back in here and update the instance variable for me. So that's allowed, but because this is a private instance variable, I cannot do that. If I made first name public, if I had public string first name here in the class, or if I just had like string first name or name first, whatever I called it, then I could get away with this, but that's poor form and you'll lose points on the AP exam. We do not do that. We always use these accessor, setter or mutator methods to manipulate the values in our instance variables, and we always make them private. A couple of other things to watch out for. Remember, all these are equivalent statements, and also you need to know like x equals x times 1 is the same as x times equal 1. Same thing with division. You can also do like x equals x times x. And I believe you can do that as a shortcut. It's not much of a shortcut, but you can do it. So these will always bump things up by 1 or decrease by 1. This will multiply x by 1, may not be very useful, right? But instead you can do things like this, where you say x times x, make shortcuts there, and so on. You can do the same types of thing with division. And I'll leave that to you, but just be aware of those shortcuts and equivalencies there. Remember, the mod operator is the percent sign. We use that to check the remainder. So if I have int x equals 4 divided by 2, x will have the answer of 2. But x equals 4 mod 2 has the remainder of 0 stored in it. So remember that. Always keep order of operations in mind whenever you're looking at any type of statement. Remember integer division, how that works, like int divided by int equals int, which may not be what you want. Accessor methods allow access to the state of any object. The state of the object, that means the instance variables. So accessor methods allow access to the instance variables and their values, and those are our getter methods like getName, so that we can inspect or use that state or those values, okay? So state of the object is referring to the instance variables and their values. Mutator methods like setters, like setName, that allows a programmer to initialize an object's instance variables, and you can possibly have other local temporary variables in a method that you're initializing, or you can change, right? You can initialize or change the instance variable through a mutator. So for example, if I use the default constructor and I allow the salary of somebody to get set to 0, I can have a mutator method setSalary that then updates that salary instance variable with 50,000. So I don't know if initialize is really actually the best word, but I can change the value, or if I need to, I guess I could say I'm initializing it to 50,000, overriding the default. Constructors initialize the instance variables with either defaults, as I just talked about, if you use the default constructor, or if in a constructor you forget to specify the salary in the employee constructor, it's going to default it to 0 since it's a numeric. Or we can use a constructor to set instance variables equal to the values specified by the programmer, things we hard code, or if you use scanner that the user enters. All right, important concepts and terms that you will see on the test, all right? Public methods provide services to clients. That's just some terminology you'll see on the test. Public methods do provide services back in main. They allow us to manipulate instance variables, set instance variables, create objects, etc. if you're using constructor. So in effect, I guess main is our client. So these public methods provide a service to the client in main. It's kind of weird terminology, but you'll see that. Public variables do not protect data. And what I meant by that is, remember when I said an instance variable, if you wanted to, you could say public string first name or name first. You can do that. You'll lose points on the exam because that's considered bad, because technically it doesn't protect the data. It allows the direct manipulation of it in main, and that's considered bad. This is considered protecting the data and the variable for some reason by using a method. Private methods, as we talked about, are helpers. They support other methods in the class file. Private variables protect data. That's why we make our instance variables private. We make constructors public. Methods like getters and setters and any other types of methods you might have are generally public, not always, but generally. Helper methods are generally private, as we saw in my example. A method declaration defines code that is executed when the class method is invoked. That's a weird way of saying that when you create an employee object and then you use a method like setName or getName, the header, that method declaration and all the body code in it, that defines what happens when that method is executed. And of course it can only be executed when you've created the object. When a class method is called, the statements of that method are executed. That's pretty straightforward. When a method's finished, such as setName, control goes back to wherever it was when the call was made. So what we're saying here is, when I have a method like getName, control passes to the employee file, a class file, the code in getName is executed, then control returns back to the very next place where it left off in main, which is the print line. That's all it's saying. So generally that's going to be sequentially from the top down unless we have loops or ifs. And that might change things a little bit as far as how many times code executes in main, or if I have an if statement, sometimes a line will execute, sometimes it won't. But the reality is the code really goes top down in main sequentially. It branches to the class file, and in the method it goes from the top of the body of code to the bottom between the two braces and executes sequentially, and then it comes back to main and it picks up on the next line where it left off. After return of control from a method, execution continues. That's true. Methods can return information back to main. Remember, we can send get name sends information back. It sends the name back to be printed out. A return type in a method